The repair shop smelled like motor oil and cold coffee, the fluorescent lights flickering above as if they, too, were unsure what was happening. I'd been crouched beside the radiator for the better part of an hour, wrench in hand, trying to convince myself that I was entirely focused on the engine, but then I heard the faintest rustle from the corner of the office. That's when I noticed her roommate, not the woman I'd been staring at for weeks in the shop's cramped back office, but the roommate who always seemed to linger just outside my line of vision, sliding under the blanket I'd absent-mindedly thrown over the chair I'd claimed as mine. "Move over," she whispered. The words were soft, careful, but the way they pressed against my ear made it impossible to ignore. I froze, wrench halfway between the radiator and the floor, my heart doing a subtle, ridiculous flip I refused to acknowledge. The blanket was warm, her shoulder brushing against mine. I could smell her subtle perfume, maybe sandalwood or vanilla, something older, calmer, deliberate. And I realized that for a second, the engine, the tools, the grease-streaked linoleum didn't exist. I glanced up, catching a shadow of movement in the dim corner of the room. There she was, the woman I hadn't been able to stop noticing these past few weeks. Mid-40s, hair loosely pinned but already escaping strands around her face, eyes that seemed to calculate everything and nothing at the same time. She was confident, but not loud, and she had this way of tilting her head slightly, a little smirk tugging at the corner of her lips, like she knew she was being watched but didn't care. Our eyes met briefly, and the electricity was subtle but undeniable. I couldn't tell if it was guilt, curiosity, or something entirely different that made my stomach tighten. Her gaze lingered a fraction too long, and then, just as quickly, she looked away, turning back to the stack of invoices she'd been pretending to organize. The roommate shifted again, closer, nudging the blanket just enough to force me to scoot over. I coughed, awkward, flustered. Sure," I muttered, my voice cracking slightly. I wasn't sure if I'd just accepted a shared blanket or agreed to something far more complicated. There was a pause, long enough that I could feel my own thoughts spinning. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the faint drip of water from the sink, the steady rhythm of my own breathing. It all became a background to the warmth pressed against me. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words lodged themselves somewhere between my throat and my chest. She didn't speak again, and I didn't either. Instead, there was a moment, a flicker, where our hands brushed as I tried to adjust, a barely there spark that made me wish it hadn't been so fleeting. I could feel her watching me, in her way, not judgmental, not teasing, just aware. And that awareness was heavier than any engine I'd ever lifted. Eventually, she shifted again, disappearing into the shadows of the room, leaving me staring at the blanket, at the faint impression of her shoulders still warm against mine, my thoughts refusing to untangle themselves. I caught my reflection in the grease-streaked window and wondered if my face looked as ridiculous as it felt. Nervous, alert, entirely consumed. And for the rest of the day, every time I tried to think about engines, invoices, or anything practical, I couldn't. I kept seeing the way she'd lingered in my peripheral vision, the warmth under the blanket, the whisper of words that weren't meant to reach anyone but me. I thought I could shake it off, but I can't stop thinking about her shoulder brushing mine, about the way she said, almost imperceptibly, "Move over." The next day, I found myself back at the shop, partly because I had work to do, partly because I couldn't shake the memory of yesterday. She was there, leaning over a counter stacked with invoices, a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and a frown that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual, though my hands itched to do something. Anything that might break the distance between us. She looked up, just briefly, before returning to her papers. "Morning," she said, voice clipped, professional. Nothing warm, nothing inviting. And yet, I noticed the slight tremor in her fingers as she flipped the pages, the faint shadows under her eyes, the way she pressed her lips together when she exhaled. Small things, but they made her human, and somehow, more magnetic. I offered to help, though I wasn't entirely sure what she needed. She didn't immediately refuse, just moved a stack of papers aside and gestured toward the workbench. "Can you check the inventory?" she asked, eyes not meeting mine. As I crouched down to organize the boxes, I could feel her presence behind me. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that I could sense her. Her perfume, subtle, calm, drifted past me, and I swallowed, pretending to focus on the labels. I could hear her sigh, soft, almost imperceptible, as she leaned against the counter, shoulders slightly slumped. "You look tired," I said, unable to stop myself. She stiffened, straightening suddenly, and I caught that flicker of vulnerability, quick, fleeting, like a candle threatened by a draft. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice was quieter than before, almost fragile. I didn't press it. Instead, I noticed the little things, the way her hair had escaped its clip in uneven strands, the faint crinkle of her eyes when she tried to smile, how her hands moved over the papers with both precision and exhaustion. I realized that I could watch her all day and never tire of it. The small habits, the micro moments of humanity she tried to hide. We worked in silence for a while, the quiet between us thick but not uncomfortable. Occasionally, our hands brushed as I passed her a stack of invoices, and each time, a subtle jolt ran through me. I could sense her noticing too, though she didn't look up to meet my eyes. Then, when I stood to stretch, she leaned slightly closer under the pretense of checking a label. Our shoulders touched. I felt her warmth, the gentle curve of her presence pressing against mine, and neither of us moved away immediately. For a heartbeat, the air between us seemed heavier, charged with something neither of us named. Her eyes flicked to mine, quick, controlled, and then away again. A quiet, almost imperceptible smile tugged at her lips, just enough for me to catch it, just enough to make my chest tighten. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. In that brief, suspended moment, I understood more than any words could convey. Fragile, guarded, hesitant. And I knew I would remember it all. When she finally straightened fully, taking a step back as if reclaiming herself, I caught the faintest tremor in her hands again. I wanted to reach out, to steady them. But instead, I just stayed still, letting the charged silence hang, letting it pull me in without permission. And even as she turned back to her work, I could feel it, the gentle pull of something forbidden, undeniable, and entirely ours. The shop was quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. Outside, rain tapped steadily against the windows, and the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. I was wiping down a workbench when I noticed her hovering near the door, phone pressed to her ear, voice low and clipped. "Yeah, I know," she muttered, rubbing the bridge of her nose. There was a pause, and I could see her jaw tighten. Tiny, unconscious movements that spoke more than her words. She ended the call, shoved the phone into her pocket, and let out a long sigh, shoulders sagging just enough that I noticed. I stepped closer. "Everything okay?" Her glance flicked to me, sharp, guarded, but not unkind. "It's nothing," she said, voice too controlled. And yet, I caught the quiver at the corner of her lips, the slight tremble in her fingers as she tucked a stray hair behind her ear. I offered a small smile, unsure if it was encouragement or intrusion. She tilted her head, eyes briefly meeting mine, and I could see the conflict there. Part of her wanted to talk, part of her wanted to retreat. I didn't push. Instead, I reached over to hand her a wrench she had left on the counter, our fingers brushing lightly. A jolt of something, electric, fragile, ran up my arm. She didn't pull away immediately. We worked side by side in silence, the storm outside keeping time with our quiet rhythm. Every so often, I'd glance at her, noticing details, the way her lips parted slightly as she concentrated, the tension in her shoulders, the faint smudge of grease on her hand from earlier. I wanted to say something that would mean more than words, but I couldn't. The electricity between us was subtle but undeniable. When I stepped a little too close to grab a tool, our arms brushed again, this time longer, and I felt her inhale sharply. My own heart was thudding, reminding me that restraint didn't come naturally. Then, just as the moment threatened to tip into something unspoken but inevitable, the phone rang again. She jumped slightly, startled, and pulled away, breaking the fragile bubble that had formed around us. She answered, and I could hear the polite, clipped voice of someone on the other end. An ex, a client, someone external, a reminder that the world was still there, demanding order, pulling her away from me. I stepped back, forcing myself to blink, to breathe, to act normal. We exchanged no words for the next few minutes, but the room felt smaller somehow, the silence now loaded with unspoken questions. Finally, she hung up, rubbing her temples, and I noticed the faint flush on her cheeks, the way she avoided my gaze. The moment was gone, replaced by ordinary motions, tools being returned, workbenches being wiped. And yet, I could still feel the warmth of her shoulder inches from mine, the almost there contact, the unclaimed tension vibrating in the space between us. I wanted to reach out again, to close the gap, to cross a line neither of us had permission to approach. But I stayed rooted, hands at my sides, heart racing, watching as she moved away to organize supplies. And in the quiet, stormlit shop, I realized how dangerous proximity could be and how intoxicating. We ended up closing the shop later than usual. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the air was heavy with damp and the scent of oil and wet asphalt. She stood near the counter, arms folded, staring out the window as if the street held answers she couldn't find. I lingered by the workbench, pretending to organize tools, but I couldn't stop noticing her. The way her shoulders slumped, the faint crease between her brows, the tension in her hands even when they rested. Finally, she spoke, low and deliberate. "Do you ever wonder what this is?" I froze, the wrench I was holding suddenly feeling absurdly heavy. I glanced at her, trying to read the expression on her face, but it was unreadable, sharp-edged with something I couldn't name. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I already had a sense of the answer. She turned slightly, eyes finally meeting mine. "Us. Here. This, whatever it is between us. It doesn't feel normal anymore." Her voice wasn't accusatory or angry. It was fragile, like she was testing herself as much as she was testing me. And in that moment, all the small things, the brushing of hands, the lingering looks, the near-touch moments, suddenly felt weighty, charged, dangerous in their subtlety. I swallowed, trying to find words that wouldn't betray too much, wouldn't overstep. I don't know," I admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what it's supposed to be." She nodded slowly, biting the inside of her cheek as if that small motion could contain her thoughts. "Exactly. That's what I mean. We can't pretend this is normal. I can't pretend." There was silence then, the kind that presses against your chest. I wanted to move closer, to bridge the gap, but the air between us felt fragile, a thread stretched taut. Instead, I just watched her, noticing details I hadn't before. The faint gray streak in her hair, the way her lips quivered when she tried to suppress an emotion, the subtle tension in her jaw. Every micro-moment was amplified by the weight of words finally spoken. "I don't want to hurt anyone," she murmured, softer now, almost to herself. Her voice trembled, though she tried to keep it steady. "But I feel like I'm already failing at that." I took a cautious step forward, not close enough to invade, just enough to let her know I was there. She didn't flinch, but she didn't reach for me either. We were caught somewhere between distance and desire, fear and need, awareness and denial. The room felt smaller, the silence louder. I realized she was trembling just slightly, her hands tightening around the edge of the counter. I wanted to say something that could fix it, anything, but the truth was too sharp, too raw. Finally, she let out a long exhale, gaze dropping to the floor. Maybe some things shouldn't be this complicated," she said, voice breaking. And then, almost imperceptibly, she whispered, "I don't know if I can stop thinking about it, or about you." The words hung in the air like smoke, and I wanted to catch them, to hold them, to dissolve the tension, but all I could do was stare, heart hammering, knowing that nothing would ever feel normal again. I hadn't expected her to bring it up, ever. Not here, not now, not in the dim corner of the shop where we'd spent hours pretending the world didn't exist outside these walls. She was sorting through a box of old receipts when she spoke, voice low, almost brittle. I used to come here after he left, she said. She didn't look at me, just traced her fingers over the edges of the papers. Not this shop, obviously, but places that smelled like work or quiet. Anywhere I could feel like the world hadn't moved on without me. I froze, wrench in hand, unsure where to put my own attention. Her confession wasn't dramatic. No raised voice, no tears spilling over. But it landed like a stone in water, sending ripples through my chest. I lost someone, she continued, finally glancing at me, eyes glassy but steady. A long time ago. I thought I'd moved past it. I thought I could handle everything. But some nights, she paused, swallowing, and I noticed the way her fingers flexed against the counter. Some nights, it still feels like I didn't get a chance to say goodbye. I stepped closer, careful not to crowd her. My own throat felt tight. I didn't know, I whispered. Not because I had any right to know, but because hearing it made everything between us feel heavier, more fragile, more real. She smiled faintly, a small, almost rueful tilt of her lips. It's fine. You wouldn't understand. No one does, really. Then she turned, rifling through the box again, and pulled out a faded photograph. She handed it to me, and I recognized him. The man she'd lost, the one who haunted the spaces she inhabited with her quiet, meticulous grace. I swallowed, unsure whether to hand it back or hold it like some fragile relic. He looks happy, I said finally, voice low. You were happy too. Her laugh was a soft, almost painful thing, barely audible over the hum of the fluorescent lights. We were, she said, turning the photo over in her hands. But it ended, and life moved forward. Somehow. And now here I am, trying not to, I don't know, mess this up again. I wanted to tell her it wasn't messed up, that we were allowed to be fragile, allowed to hesitate, allowed to tremble like this. But the words felt small, inadequate. Instead, I simply nodded, letting her vulnerability settle between us like a shared weight. Then, almost without warning, she brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, looked at me, and said softly, I've forgotten what it's like to trust someone without fear. And yet, I feel it right now. I froze, caught off guard by the honesty, by the tremor beneath her calm, by the seismic shift that didn't announce itself but hit me anyway. The room, the box, the photograph, all of it became secondary to the quiet gravity of her admission. And in that fragile, suspended moment, all I could do was meet her gaze and feel the impossible weight of what she had just shared, knowing that the world we'd tiptoed around had irrevocably changed. The shop smelled of rain-soaked asphalt and metal, the evening settling over us like a soft, heavy blanket. We were alone, the world outside shut away by closed shutters and the steady patter of drizzle. She was at the counter, folding a few shirts we'd meant to restock, and I was perched on the edge of the workbench, pretending to check inventory, but really just watching. You're quiet, she said suddenly, without looking up. Her voice wasn't teasing or accusatory, just aware. I'm thinking, I said, shrugging, though I knew it wasn't a convincing excuse. She finally glanced at me, and for a moment, her guardedness wavered. The faintest crease softened between her brows, and I realized she wasn't just noticing me. She was letting me in, carefully, but deliberately. I don't want to overstep, she murmured, her fingers idly brushing a folded sleeve. And I don't want to pretend this isn't complicated. I felt the tension in my chest ease slightly, not because it was resolved, but because she had said it aloud. Because the truth, however fragile, was now somewhere between us. I don't want to pretend either, I admitted quietly. My voice sounded small in the large, empty room, but it carried more weight than I expected. She nodded, a slow, deliberate motion, like she was weighing every word before letting it settle. We worked side by side in silence for a few minutes, the kind of silence that isn't awkward but necessary, a shared breath between two people who had finally acknowledged the pull between them. Then, without thinking, I reached over to hand her a small stack of shirts. Our fingers brushed, brief, electric, but not startling. She didn't pull away immediately. Instead, she lingered for a heartbeat, letting the contact speak where words had failed. I exhaled softly, almost unconsciously, and she finally met my eyes. There was no rush, no dramatic confession. Just understanding. Just the quiet acknowledgement that we had both felt this, had both hesitated, had both arrived at the same unspoken place. She leaned slightly against the counter, and I shifted closer on the workbench. Not touching, not invading, just existing in the same space, the storm outside fading to a backdrop for this small, earned moment. And then, gently, almost imperceptibly, our hands found each other. A fingertip brushed, a soft clasp, and it was enough. A quiet seal, simple and human. No promises, no declarations, just the truth of our presence, fragile and undeniable. We stayed like that for several minutes, breathing quietly, letting the shared warmth of our connection fill the space. Outside, the rain had softened, the world moving on as it always did, oblivious to the small, seismic shift in the corner of an ordinary repair shop. Finally, she straightened, smoothing her hair, letting our hands slip apart. She smiled faintly, not at me, not at the room, just, lightly, like a secret we both carried now. I nodded, heart still thudding, words unnecessary. The moment had passed, but something had shifted irreversibly, quietly, but completely. And as she returned to organizing supplies, I stayed where I was, watching, feeling, and knowing. Nothing needed to be said anymore. It's been weeks since that night in the shop, the rain still lingering in memory more than in reality. I keep thinking about how fragile everything felt then, and how, somehow, the small, quiet decisions we made changed everything without a single grand gesture. She's different now, not in obvious ways, not in a way anyone else would notice. But she laughs a little softer, lets herself linger in a room, lets me linger in her presence. The guardedness isn't gone, but it's lighter, like she trusts herself to feel without fear. And I've changed too. I notice the little things now, the tilt of her head when she's thinking, the subtle catch in her breath, the way her hands move when she's focused. I don't need words to understand her. I just do. And I don't try to overthink what might happen next. I stay present. And somehow, that feels like the truest form of connection. We still spend hours side by side, sometimes talking, sometimes silent. Sometimes a hand brushes another. Sometimes it rests briefly, just enough to remind us both that we're here, that we're together in this slow, fragile way that feels earned. It's not dramatic, it's not cinematic, it's human. And that's enough. I think about the lessons tucked into the small, suspended moments. How proximity can be electric, how restraint can feel heavier than action, how vulnerability isn't weakness, and how love doesn't always announce itself in fireworks. Sometimes it's a shared breath, a quiet understanding, the warmth of someone's presence pressed against yours without permission, and yet entirely allowed. I don't know what the future holds, and maybe that's the point. We've learned to navigate uncertainty without panic, to lean into quiet moments without expectation, to hold something delicate, knowing it could slip, and still choose to stay. And now, when I see her, when she glances up from the counter or brushes a loose strand of hair behind her ear, I feel the afterglow of everything we've experienced. The tension, the near misses, the confessions, the shared silences, they've all led here, to this ordinary yet extraordinary peace. Sometimes, I catch her looking at me and think about how far we've come without saying the words we both know. The storm has passed, the shop is warm, and in that quiet corner of our world, love exists in its most patient, unassuming form. And maybe that's what makes it so real. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?